The sun had bleached the North Carolina soil to the color of bone, but the heat wasn't nearly as suffocating as the silence in the general store when Reygan walked in. As she reached for a rusted valve to save her dying crop, a neighbor's gnarled hand slammed the box shut, and the sound of a dozen men spitting in unison echoed against the floorboards. They didn't see a farmer fighting for her land. They saw the daughter of a man they believed had bled the whole county dry. Outside, a black SUV sat idling like a vulture in her driveway, the chrome grille gleaming with the promise of a debt that could only be paid in dirt and blood. Hours later, suspended 20 feet above the concrete floor of her crumbling barn, Reygan felt the ancient timber snap. As she lunged for a crossbeam, her fingers didn't find wood. They slammed into a cold, metallic edge hidden deep within the hollow of the wall. It was a heavy iron box, sealed with a rusted padlock and buried behind a lie that had lasted 20 years. Below her, the bank's foreclosure notice fluttered in the dust. But as her weight tore the box from its hiding place, she realized the paper in her hand wasn't nearly as dangerous as the secrets now falling from the ceiling. The screen door slammed behind her, and the heat hit like a fist, thick, wet, clinging to her skin. Inside the trailer, the air conditioner wheezed, coughing out lukewarm breath that did nothing against the afternoon's weight. Reygan Whitaker wiped her forearm across her forehead, smearing dirt and sweat into her hairline. The radio on the counter hissed static, then spat out a weather report. Drought conditions persist, no relief in sight. She turned it off with a sharp twist of her wrist. Outside, the gravel crunched under her boots as she crossed to the shed. The hinges groaned when she yanked the door open, and the scent of motor oil and rusted metal rushed out. Her fingers brushed the workbench, tracing the edge of a wrench left where she'd dropped it last night. The metal was still warm from the sun's grip. She didn't stay inside the shade for long. The land was calling, or rather, it was screaming in a low, parched thrum that vibrated through the soles of her boots. The tobacco field stretched out toward the horizon, a sea of wilted green that looked more like scorched earth than a harvest. Reygan walked toward the irrigation pump, her shadow a short, jagged blotch on the cracked soil. Every step kicked up a puff of fine, gray dust that coated her throat. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy wool blanket soaked in lead. She reached the main pump, a skeletal beast of rusted iron and leaking gaskets that stood as the only thing between her and total ruin. Her breath hitched as she gripped the heavy iron wheel of the intake valve. It was slick with old grease and new sweat. She threw her weight against it, her boots sliding in the loose dirt. The metal screeched, a dry, mechanical groan that set her teeth on edge. Nothing moved. She tried again, a guttural sound escaping her throat, her muscles screaming under the strain. The valve was frozen, locked tight by age and the relentless expansion of metal under the North Carolina sun. "Come on, you piece of junk," she hissed, her voice cracking. She hammered her fist against the pipe, a futile gesture that only sent a jolt of pain up her arm. She looked out at the rows of tobacco. The leaves were curling into brown, brittle tubes, the life being sucked out of them by a sky that hadn't surrendered a drop of rain in weeks. She dropped to her knees, the heat of the earth searing through her denim. She pressed her forehead against the cool, dead metal of the pump. The silence of the fields was absolute, broken only by the frantic, rhythmic buzzing of cicadas that sounded like a fever dream. The weight of the silence was broken not by water, but by the shrill cry of the mailbox at the end of the long dirt drive. It was a sound she had come to loathe. Reygan stood, wiping her palms on her thighs, and trudged toward the road. The metal flag was up, a red finger pointing at her failure. Inside, among the grocery store circulars and the seed catalogs she could no longer afford, lay a thick, white envelope. The return address bore the embossed logo of the Rocky Mount First National Bank. Her fingers, stained with the yellow nicotine of 1,000 leaves, trembled as she tore the edge. The word foreclosure was stamped across the top in a shade of red that made the surrounding drought look pale. 5 figures. That was the price of her father's legacy. A debt she had inherited, along with the calluses and the stubborn pride that kept her from screaming. She crumpled the paper in her fist. The heat seemed to intensify, the air shimmering in waves off the asphalt of the county road. She stood there, a lone figure in the vast, dying landscape, clutching the official death warrant of the Whitaker farm to her chest. The shadows of the oaks at the edge of the property began to stretch, long and thin, like reaching fingers. The drive into town was a blur of dust and resentment. She needed a replacement valve, a gasket, anything to make the water flow. When she stepped into Henderson's general store, the bell above the door chimed with a cheerful irony. The smell of roasted coffee and floor wax usually calmed her, but today it felt suffocating. Old Man Miller, a farmer who had once shared whiskey with her father on their porch, was standing by the counter. As Reygan approached, he turned his head and spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the floorboards, inches from her boots. The low murmur of conversation died instantly. Silence pooled around her, thick and oily. She reached for a box of brass fittings on the shelf, but a hand, rough and gnarled, slid the box out of her reach. It was Grady, a man whose fields bordered hers to the north. His eyes were slivers of ice in a face mapped by bitter years. "Think you can just walk in here like nothing happened?" Grady asked, his voice a low rasp. "Like your old man didn't bleed this county dry before he skipped out?" "My father didn't steal from anyone, Grady," Reygan said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "Tell that to my empty silo," he sneered. A titter of laughter erupted from the back of the store. Reygan felt the heat rising in her neck. She didn't look at them. She couldn't. She turned on her heel and walked out, the bell chiming again, followed by a loud, mocking guffaw that followed her all the way to her truck. She was halfway down the gravel drive of the farm when she saw it. A black SUV, polished to a mirror's shine, sat idling near her porch. It looked like a predatory insect crouched in the dirt. The chrome grille caught the dying sun, throwing a blinding glare into her eyes. Silas Whitaker stepped out of the vehicle before she had even killed the engine of her truck. He was her father's brother, but the resemblance ended at the name. Silas wore a suit that cost more than her entire harvest. His shoes were buffed to a high gloss, untouched by the red clay of the fields. He smelled of expensive cologne and air conditioning. "Reygan," he said, his voice smooth as silk over a stone. "You look tired." "What are you doing here, Silas?" She didn't move toward him. She stayed by the rusted fender of her Ford, a 10-yard gap of suspicion between them. "I heard about the bank notice. News travels fast in a small town, especially when people are looking for reasons to talk." He leaned against the hood of his car, eyes scanning the peeling paint of the farmhouse with an expression of practiced pity. "It's over, Reygan. The drought, the debt. It's a weight no woman should carry alone." He followed her into the kitchen, his presence making the room feel smaller, more cramped. He laid out a sheaf of papers on the scarred wooden table, pushing aside Emily's half-finished drawing of a sun. He held a gold-plated pen like a weapon. "Sign the land over to me," Silas said softly. "I'll clear the debts. I'll give you enough to get a nice apartment in the city. Emily could go to a real school. She wouldn't have to grow up with dirt under her fingernails and the ghost of a thief over her shoulder. Reygan looked at the contract. The offer was a pittance, a fraction of what the acreage was worth, even in a dry year. She looked at Emily, playing with a headless doll in the corner, oblivious to the man trying to buy her heritage for a handful of silver. Then she looked at Silas. His smile didn't reach his eyes, those gray, colorless eyes that saw only profit and loss. "Get out," Reygan said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the hum of the refrigerator. Silas's face darkened, the mask of the benevolent uncle slipping to reveal a sharp, jagged edge. "You're being foolish. Proud and foolish, just like your father. When the sheriff comes to put your things in the ditch, don't come crying to me. I wouldn't crawl to you if you were the last man with a well in the state," she spat. Silas stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He leaned in close, his voice a whisper that carried the chill of a grave. "I'll see you in the dirt, Reygan. I won't leave you a single cent of what's left of this name." He slammed the door on his way out, the vibration shaking the old windows in their frames. Reygan turned the deadbolt, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the counter to stay upright. The roar of his SUV fading into the distance felt like a temporary reprieve, not a victory. The clouds were building by evening, bruised purple masses that promised rain, but usually delivered nothing but wind. Reygan grabbed her tool bag. The roof of the old tobacco barn had a hole that would let the damp in if the storm finally broke. And she couldn't afford to lose the little leaf she had managed to cure. The ladder groaned as she climbed. The wood of the barn was silvered by age, brittle as bone. Up on the roof, the wind whipped her hair across her face, tasting of ozone and distant dust. She crawled across the shingles, feeling the structure sway beneath her. She was reaching for a loose nail when the world gave way. A dry, sharp crack, the sound of a bone breaking, echoed through the rafters. The gray board beneath her right foot vanished. Reygan gasped, her stomach leaping into her throat as she plummeted. Instinct took over. She flung her arms forward, her fingers raking across the rough-hewn surface of a crossbeam. She hung there, suspended over the concrete floor 20 feet below. Her shoulders felt as if they were being pulled from their sockets. The rough wood bit into her palms, splinters driving deep into the meat of her hands. Her boots kicked uselessly in the empty air. Below, her hammer hit the floor with a dull, final clang. "Help," she whispered, but the wind swallowed it. With a roar of effort that burned her lungs, she swung her weight, hooking an elbow over a secondary strut. She pulled herself up, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She lay there for a long minute, cheek pressed against the dusty wood, smelling the ancient scent of dried tobacco and bat guano. As her vision cleared, she noticed a flicker of something in the dark recess where the roof met the wall, a place the light hadn't touched in decades. It was a glint of metal beneath a layer of gray filth. She reached into the gap, her fingers brushing against something cold and heavy. She pulled it out, a bundle wrapped in rotting, blackened burlap. Beneath the cloth sat a steel box, its lid secured by a massive, rusted padlock. Reygan lowered herself in the box to the floor of the barn, her movements robotic with shock. She found a heavy iron bar and struck the lock. On the third blow, it shattered. Inside, protected by layers of oiled paper, lay a leather-bound ledger. She opened it, and her breath stopped. It was her father's handwriting, neat, sloping, and unmistakable. But these weren't the ledgers the bank had seen. These were records of a different kind. July 14th. Loaned Miller $500 for seed. No interest, paid in labor. August 2nd. Forgave Grady's debt on the tractor. He's got 3 kids and a sick wife. Page after page showed a history of a man who had carried the entire county on his back. But it was the margins that turned Reygan's blood to ice. In the edges of the pages, in a different, sharper hand, Silas's hand, were notes. Calculations of how to turn these acts of charity into legal debts. Forged signatures. Plans to systematically drain the farm's accounts while making it look like her father was the one squandering the money. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't been a thief. He had been a martyr, and Silas had been the architect of his ruin. A flash of lightning illuminated the barn, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that shook the earth. Reygan clutched the book to her chest. The rain finally began to fall, a hard, rhythmic drumming on the tin roof. But it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like the beginning of a war. By the time the sun began to peek through the dissipating clouds the next morning, Reygan was already in her truck, the ledger tucked securely under the seat. She drove straight to the sheriff's office in town. James Miller had been her father's friend, or so she had always believed. The office was small, smelling of stale coffee and the hum of a cheap fluorescent light. Miller looked up from his desk, his weathered face shifting into a mask of weary kindness. "Reygan," he said, leaning back. "Rough night? I heard the storm caught the north end of the county pretty hard." "I found something, James. Something that changes everything." She set the heavy ledger on his desk. Miller didn't reach for it. He just stared at the leather cover. "Reygan, some things are better left buried. The past is a heavy thing to dig up." "Not when it's a lie," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and hope. "My father didn't steal that money. Silas did. He framed him, and he's been using those fake debts to squeeze the life out of us for 20 years. Miller sighed and stood up. "Let me get us some coffee. We're going to be here a while if we're going to go through all this." He disappeared into the back room. Reygan sat, her hands folded in her lap, trying to calm the buzzing in her brain. Her eyes wandered over his desk. There, half hidden under a stack of arrest reports, was a blue folder with a gold-embossed logo. Silas's logo. She reached out, her heart skipping a beat, and nudged the top paper aside. It was a payout ledger. There, in black and white, was a list of consultation fees paid to James Miller. The amounts were staggering, 4 zeros at the end of every entry. The sound of the coffee pot gurgling in the back room felt like a countdown. Reygan didn't think. She grabbed her father's ledger, shoved it back into her bag, and bolted. She hit the street just as the sun broke through the remaining clouds, blinding and harsh. She didn't look back to see if Miller was following. She threw the truck into gear and tore out of town. The realization settled in her gut like a stone. The law in Rocky Mount was just another thing Silas Whitaker had bought and paid for. When she turned onto the farm road, she saw the devastation before she even reached the house. The main irrigation line, the one she had spent all week trying to fix, had been hacked apart. It wasn't a mechanical failure this time. The thick metal pipe had been sliced clean, likely with a portable saw. Water was geysering into the air, a beautiful, tragic waste, turning the dusty driveway into a muddy swamp, while the tobacco rows just yards away remained bone dry and dying. She jumped out of the truck, her boots sinking into the muck. She ran to the manual shutoff, but the valve handle had been snapped off. "No!" she screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the escaping water. The destruction didn't stop there. The door to the shed was hanging off its hinges, and the sound of breaking glass echoed from inside the barn. She ran toward the noise, her heart hammering. 2 men she recognized as Silas's hired hands were inside the barn. They weren't looking for anything. They were just destroying. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his chin, raised a heavy boot and brought it down on a small pink shape on the floor. It was Emily's doll. The plastic face crumpled with a sickening crunch. "Hey!" Reygan yelled, grabbing a pitchfork from the wall. The men stopped. The one with the scar looked at her, a slow, yellow-toothed grin spreading across his face. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored. "Silas says you're living in a pigsty, Reygan," the man said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "Says it's no place for a little girl. Social services are going to agree when they see this mess." He stepped toward her, his shadow long and menacing on the barn floor. "You should have taken the deal. Now you're going to lose the farm, and you're going to lose the kid. That's a lot to lose for a dusty old book." He reached out and shoved her, his hand slamming into her shoulder and pinning her against the rough wood of the wall. He smelled of cheap beer and stale tobacco. "Give us the ledger, and maybe the lady from the county won't be so hard on you." Reygan spat in his face. The man's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened until she felt the bone groan. He leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Tomorrow morning. Be ready to say goodbye." He dropped her, and the two men walked out, pausing only to kick over a stack of curing racks. Reygan slumped against the wall, the silence that followed their departure even heavier than the noise of their destruction. She ran to the house, her fingers fumbling for the phone. She needed to call someone, anyone, outside the county. But when she lifted the receiver, there was nothing. No dial tone, just a hollow, dead silence. She followed the cord down to the floor. It had been sliced through with a clean, professional cut. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket. No service. She looked out the window and saw a gray van idling on the public road at the edge of her property. A signal jammer. Silas wasn't just squeezing her. He was erasing her. The black SUV returned an hour later. Silas didn't even get out this time. He just rolled down the window, his sunglasses reflecting the ruined barn and the flooded driveway. "The offer is still on the table, Reygan," he called out. "But the price just went down. Think about Emily. Think about where she'll sleep tomorrow night if you stay stubborn." He drove away, leaving a plume of dust that hung in the stagnant air. Reygan looked toward the road. A patrol car sat at the entrance to her drive, its lights off, but its presence unmistakable. A deputy was leaning against the hood, watching her. She was a prisoner on her own land. As the sun began to set, casting a bloody red glow over the dying tobacco, she saw movement at the edge of the fields. A group of men was approaching. Grady, Miller, and half a dozen others. They weren't coming to help. They held papers in their hands, the fake debt notices Silas had distributed like poison. "We want our money, Whitaker," Grady shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. "Your father stole from us, and we're taking it back out of your hide if we have to." A rock shattered the kitchen window, the glass spraying across the floor where Emily had been eating her dinner just minutes before. Reygan grabbed Emily and pulled her into the hallway, away from the windows. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, pulling the girl into her lap and covering her ears. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though she could feel her own heart trying to kick its way out of her chest. "It's just a game. We're just playing a game." Outside, the shouts continued, a chorus of manufactured hate fueled by decades of Silas's lies. Reygan squeezed the ledger in her hand. The leather was cool, the only thing in her world that felt solid. She realized then that Silas didn't just want the land. He wanted the truth dead. He had turned her neighbors into a mob because the truth was the only thing that could destroy him. She sat in the dark, the only light the distant, flickering orange of a fire someone had started in a trash barrel near the road. She was alone, surrounded by enemies, with no way to call for help. But as she looked down at the ledger, she realized she didn't need a phone. She just needed a voice. The fire started around midnight. Reygan didn't smell it at first. The scent of wood smoke was common enough in the fall. But then came the acrid, biting stench of burning rubber and the roar of air being sucked into a vacuum. She bolted to the window. The barn was a pillar of fire. The old dry timber was a perfect fuel, and the flames were already leaping 30 feet into the air, turning the night into a hellish, artificial noon. The ledger. She had left the steel box in the barn after the men had left, tucked back into its hiding spot for safety. "Emily, stay here. Don't move from this spot." Reygan sprinted across the yard. The heat was a physical wall, pushing her back, searing the moisture from her eyes. She didn't stop. She drenched her jacket in the puddle from the broken irrigation line and threw it over her head. Inside the barn, the world was orange and screaming. The roar of the fire was so loud she couldn't hear her own thoughts. Beams were crashing down, sending up geysers of sparks. She crawled along the floor, where the air was slightly clearer, her lungs burning with every jagged breath. She saw it, the glint of the steel box through a curtain of flame. She lunged for it, her hands screaming as they made contact with the heated metal. She didn't let go. She tucked the box under her arm, the heat blistering her skin through her clothes. A massive support beam groaned above her. She threw herself toward the side door just as the roof collapsed behind her in a thunderous explosion of ash and timber. She tumbled into the dirt, gasping, her hands a map of raw, red pain. She didn't stop to look at them. She clutched the box to her chest, the metal still hot enough to singe her shirt. The sirens started then. Not fire trucks, but the high, twin-tone wail of police cruisers. 2 white vans with the county social services seal and 3 patrol cars screeched into the yard, their headlights cutting through the smoke. James Miller stepped out of the lead car, his face grim. Beside him was a woman in a gray suit, holding a clipboard like a shield. "Reygan Whitaker," the woman said, her voice clinical and cold. "We've received reports of a fire and an unsafe environment for a minor. Given the lack of water and the clear physical danger, we are taking Emily into emergency protective custody." "No!" Reygan stepped forward, but 2 deputies caught her arms. She screamed as their hands clamped down on her burned forearms. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike that drove her to her knees. She watched, helpless, as they led Emily out of the house. The girl was sobbing, her small hands reaching out. "Mama! Mama, don't let them!" "Emily!" Reygan fought, but the deputies held her fast. They threw the girl into the back of one of the vans. Silas's man, the one with the scar, was the one who closed the door. He gave Reygan a small, mocking wave as the van began to pull away. Silas stepped out from behind the patrol cars, his suit still perfect, his expression one of tragic disappointment. He held out the eviction notice. "It's over, Reygan," he said quietly. "The bank has sold the debt to me. You have no home, no farm, and now, no daughter. Sign the papers, and I'll make sure the foster placement is a good one. Otherwise..." He let the threat hang in the air. Reygan looked at him. She looked at the smoldering ruins of the barn, the burned skin of her hands, and the empty space where her daughter had been. Something inside her, the last shred of fear, simply evaporated. "I'm not signing anything, Silas," she said, her voice coming from a place deep and cold. She walked toward the house, the deputies letting her go, perhaps thinking she was finally broken. She didn't go to the bedroom to pack. She went to the old shortwave radio in the den. the one her father had used to coordinate the harvest before cell phones existed. She keyed the mic. It was a wide broadcast channel, the one every farmer in the county kept on in their barns and kitchens. "This is Reygan Whitaker," she said, her voice steady and hard as a diamond. "In 1 hour, I'll be at the center of the North Field. I have my father's real ledgers. I have the records of every cent Silas Whitaker stole from your families. I have the names, the dates, and the proof of the forged signatures. If you want to know why you're all poor while he's rich, come and hear the truth. If you don't come, you're as much of a thief as he is." She clicked it off. She walked out to her old flatbed truck, her hands wrapped in greasy rags. She started the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, a defiant growl in the quiet morning air. She drove to the center of the field, the massive orange harvest moon hanging low and heavy in the sky like a witness. She didn't have to wait long. The headlights began to appear at the edge of the property. 1 pair, then 5, then 20. Tractors, rusted pickups, and late-model SUVs. They formed a jagged circle around her truck, their engines idling in a low, expectant thrum. Reygan stood in the bed of the truck. She turned on the high-intensity work light mounted to the cab, the beam cutting through the darkness and hitting Silas Whitaker as he stepped out of his car. He looked small in the glare, his shadow stretching out behind him like a stain. "You're trespassing, Reygan," Silas shouted, though he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. "I own this land. Sheriff, arrest her." Miller moved forward, but he stopped when Grady stepped in front of him. Then another farmer. Then another. A wall of denim and flannel formed between the law and the truck. Reygan opened the ledger. The edges were charred, the scent of smoke still clinging to the paper. But the ink was clear. October 1994. Reygan read, her voice amplified by a megaphone. Silas Whitaker took a $3,000 payment from the Henderson estate. He told the Hendersons the bank had seized it. He told my father he'd used it to pay the county taxes. He kept it. Here is the bank routing number he used to hide it. A murmur went through the crowd. June 1998, she continued, her voice gaining strength. The Drought Relief Fund. Silas was the treasurer. He reported $4,000 in losses. The ledger shows that money went into a private account in Raleigh. Your names are all here listed as paid, but none of you saw a dime. "She's lying," Silas screamed, lunging toward the truck. "She's a crazy woman trying to save a dead farm." He reached the side of the bed and tried to grab the book, his fingers clawing at the leather. Reygan didn't pull away. She leaned down, looking him straight in the eye. "Look at the signatures, Silas," she whispered. "My father was a better man than you, and he was a better record keeper." Grady stepped up and snatched a page Reygan held out. He looked at it, then at the receipt he'd pulled from his own pocket. His face went from confusion to a cold, murderous rage. "That's his hand," Grady said, pointing at Silas. "That's his damn curly S. He's been charging me interest on a debt that was paid 10 years ago." The mood of the crowd shifted. It wasn't a mob anymore. It was a jury. Miller tried to push through, his hand on his gun. "I need that book, Reygan. It's evidence." "It's the truth, James," she said. "And if you take it, I have 3 copies already on their way to the state attorney's office. You want to go down with him? Or you want to do your job for once?" Miller stopped. He looked at the faces of the men he had grown up with, men who were now looking at him with the same loathing they had once reserved for the Whitakers. He slowly took his hand off his holster. Silas saw the tide turning. He turned to run, to get to his car, but the circle of farmers had closed. There was no way out. "Where's my daughter, Silas?" Reygan asked, her voice echoing across the field. "I don't know what you're talking about," he hissed, but he was shaking now, his composure shattered. "James," Reygan said, looking at the sheriff. "Bring her back, now, or the next name I read is yours." Miller didn't hesitate. He barked an order into his radio. 10 minutes later, the white van returned. The door opened, and Emily ran across the dirt, her small feet kicking up the dust of the land that was finally, truly hers. Reygan jumped down from the truck and caught her, the pain in her hands forgotten as she held the only thing that mattered. The sun began to rise then, a pale gold light spilling over the horizon, illuminating the rows of tobacco. The farmers didn't go home. They didn't go to the police station. They went to their trucks and came back with tools. By noon, the sound of tractors filled the air. Not just Reygan's, but Grady's, Miller's, and the others. They worked the rows together, harvesting the leaf before the heat of the day could ruin what was left. Reygan stood on the porch of the farmhouse, Emily at her side. Silas was gone, led away in the back of a patrol car, his suit finely stained with the dust of the county he had tried to steal. The farm was still in debt. The barn was a ruin. The crop was thin. But as she watched the neighbors who had once spat at her boots now working her land to save her future, Reygan Whitaker felt the weight finally lift from her shoulders. She looked at her hands, raw, blistered, and dirty. She flexed her fingers, feeling the sting of the healing skin. She wasn't afraid of the work. She never had been. She took a deep breath of the morning air, tasting the sweetness of the tobacco and the promise of rain on the horizon. For the first time in 20 years, the Whitaker name didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a foundation,